You probably heard the big news a few days ago that Amazon has taken full creative control over the James Bond film series. And very quickly, I'm extremely skeptical about Amazon controlling this series. And I just feel like they're going to MCUify it and make it a big shared universe, all these needless spin offs and prequels. And like I said, very skeptical. And with the Broccoli family handing over the reins of the Bond franchise creatively, it does mark the end of an era. And I wanted to mark the end of that era by finally doing this video. It struck me about 5-10 seconds ago that now's a pretty good time to finally do my top 10 favourite James Bond films, because this is a video I've wanted to do for quite a while. Because I'm a lifelong James Bond fan. I've watched the films ever since I was a kid, and I wanted to finally celebrate that in a big video like this. So yeah, let's just get into it. These are my top 10 favourite Bond films. And starting off at number 10 is the film that started the Bond franchise all the way back in 1962. We're going with Dr. No. Now, Dr. No being the very first Bond film in 1962, of course, means it's not the most exciting James Bond film, it's not the most action-packed James Bond film, but the thing I honestly dig the most about this film is the vibes. The Crab Key, Jamaica vibes, you know, the Underneath the Mango Tree song. It's a surprisingly chilled out, relaxed film amidst the espionage and James Bond being kind of a cold-blooded assassin. I've never read the Bond books by Ian Fleming, but from what I understand, that's his characterization. He's a cold-blooded killer. And they have sprinkles of that in Dr. No, like the scene where he kills Professor Dent and he says, "That's a Smith & Wesson, and you've had your six." And just kills him right there, just stonewall. And it just shows that when Bond means business, he means business. But when it comes time to, you know, crack the one-liners and seduce the ladies, he'll do that as well. It's a simple film with a relatively easy storyline to follow, and again, just some really good chilled out vibes in the Jamaica setting. The Underneath the Mango Tree song is one of my favourite things in the entire James Bond series. I love the Three Blind Mice song at the very beginning as well. It's an efficient start to the James Bond series. Coming in at number 9, I'm going with nostalgia on this one. This is my childhood James Bond film, which might be surprising to hear, but it's actually Live and Let Die with Roger Moore. For whatever reason, this is the James Bond film that I watched over and over again when I was a kid. And for that, this is my most nostalgic James Bond film. In fact, one of my favourite toys as a kid that I've recently reacquired through eBay is this San Monique double-decker bus. Now, obviously I've kept it in the box, but the actual top deck comes off like it does in the film. And yeah, I have loved this toy as a kid, and I recently, again, got it through eBay because nostalgia, and I just wanted to own it again. And it sits on my shelf and I see it every day. And yeah, it just reminds me of my nostalgia for the film. But the actual film itself, I still enjoy and I still think it's good. I know some people don't dig the voodoo vibes of it, but I do. This is Roger Moore's first outing as Bond, and there was a lot of pressure for him to live up to Sean Connery, or at least be really good and just not fade into Sean Connery's shadow. But I thought he did a good job. He establishes himself as a different kind of James Bond. You see in this that he's going to be the more witty James Bond, the more comedic James Bond. And I know that's a big debate. A lot of people prefer dark and serious Bond. Some people prefer the light-hearted, jokey Bond. I like Roger Moore in moderation. That's my way of saying I'm not a big fan of Roger Moore's later James Bond films, i.e. Octopussy and A View to a Kill, where the campiness just went way too far. But in the earlier films that Roger Moore did, he has that lightheartedness, but it's reined in. And again, like Sean Connery in the earlier films, when he gets serious, when it's time to actually do business, he does business. And he shows that in Live and Let Die. And again, I enjoy the voodoo vibes of the film, the San Monique setting, the musical score by George Martin, I really enjoy. I love the theme song by Paul McCartney. It's actually one of my favourite James Bond theme songs, to be honest. The speedboat chase through the Louisiana Bayou is straight up one of the best chase scenes in the whole Bond franchise. Some really, really good stunts in there. All around, a solid first Bond film for Roger Moore. Coming in at number 8 is another Roger Moore film, and in my opinion, this, I think, is the most underrated James Bond film of all time. It's For Your Eyes Only. For Your Eyes Only came after Moonraker, which is that James Bond film, the one that jumped the shark and took James Bond to space. And with this film, the producers wanted to bring it back down to earth, and I thought they were very successful in doing that. For Your Eyes Only, I think, is Roger Moore's From Russia with Love. It's a more serious, down-to-earth, spy espionage thriller with Roger Moore's Bondisms sprinkled on top. And I'm kind of surprised that it's not held in higher regard in the James Bond fandom. I'm not saying the villain is the most memorable of all time, But I mean, compared to Roger Moore's other Bond films, again like Moonraker and A View to a Kill and Octopussy, this is light years ahead of that. And I'm just glad that Roger Moore had this kind of Bond film in his tenure. But I think it's widely agreed across the whole fandom that the best James Bond film of Roger Moore's tenure is The Spy Who Loved Me, which is my number 7. Simply put, The Spy Who Loved Me has the blueprint of a James Bond film through and through. Every single trademark of James Bond is here, but the film just executes it really, really well. It has a little bit of, that over-the-top nature with, the underwater facility of Stromberg, but they pull it off in a vibe that's not too silly. And again, the action scenes are great. I love the Lotus Esprit, the submersible car. It's one of the most iconic James Bond cars. Jaws is by far the best henchman character of the Bond franchise. The fights with him are fun, and the plot's really fun. I love Anya Amsova. I think she's one of the best Bond girls, one of the more intriguing Bond girls. Where I just said For Your Eyes Only is Roger Moore's From Russia with Love, I'd say The Spy Who Loved Me is Roger Moore's Goldfinger. It's Roger Moore's quintessential Bond film, the one that everyone remembers him for the most, and for very good reason. Now, at number 6 is one of the most noteworthy Bond films of all time, and that's On Her Majesty's Secret Service with George Lazenby. Noteworthy, of course, for being George Lazenby's only appearance as James Bond, and it was very risky what they did, casting a 29-year-old Australian model who had never acted before ever as James Bond. But I gotta say, George Lazenby does a good job in this. And Diana Rigg as Tracy DiVincenzo is one of the all-time best Bond girls. She was the first Bond girl that didn't exist purely as something for James Bond to seduce and sleep with. She was a full-fledged character with emotion. And you actually buy the romance between Bond and Tracy. You buy the fact that this is a genuine romance and it's not just Bond trying to seduce a woman. But what makes On Her Majesty's Secret Service such an important Bond film in my eyes is the treatment of James Bond as a character, because the Sean Connery Bond, as badass and as awesome as he was, super spy. In this film, James Bond, for the very first time in the franchise, feels like a vulnerable human being. The scene that always comes to mind is where Bond is being pursued by Blofeld's henchmen in that ice rink, and he's in the crowd and he's sitting there and they're closing in, and he actually looks like he's kind of scared before Tracy finds him, gives him that smile, that really heartfelt feel-good moment. And it just elevates the drama of the film because you feel like James Bond is in actual danger for the very first time. Again, I love Sean Connery, I love Roger Moore, I love James Bond as the super awesome, fun, badass spy. But when James Bond is vulnerable, that's when the character really excels on screen for me. And I gotta say, the filmmaking and directing really leveled up in this one. There's something about the way this film was shot and put together that just feels a lot more cinematic. I think of the scene where James Bond is going to Blofeld's hideout for the first time, and the helicopter's going through the Swiss Alps, and you have John Barry's incredible score, the Journey to Blofeld's Hideaway piece of music, and it's just like, man, this is something different. John Barry's musical score for this film in general is just so goddamn good. A lot of people label On Her Majesty's Secret Service as the most underrated James Bond film of all time, but in recent years, I've seen it regarded as one of the all-time best Bond films. So in my view, I don't see the film as underrated because it's always held in such high regard and praise as one of the best of the franchise, because it is one of the best of the franchise, hence why it's my number 6. Coming in at number 5 is a film I've referenced a couple of times already, and that's From Russia with Love. Sean Connery's second Bond film, 1963, and after the success of Dr. No, they doubled the budget for this film, and it really does show, because it's a better made film, there's more locations, the story goes a bit more all over the place in a good way, and the action scenes are a lot more exciting. They do a bit more with the action scenes, like the helicopter chase at the end. And like I was saying about For Your Eyes Only, this is a spy espionage thriller with a really intriguing story and some really good action scenes to boot. And you also got the first Bond henchman in the form of Red Grant, who is badass. I love that character. The train fight with him and Bond is iconic. It's been emulated a number of times within the James Bond franchise in other films. And once again, John Barry's musical score, the opening credits theme, iconic stuff. By the way, who remembers the From Russia with Love game on PS2 back in the day? That was a pretty good game from what I remember. Coming in at number 4 is Sean Connery's most iconic Bond film. It is Goldfinger. Like everyone said for the past 60 years, Goldfinger is the film that really established all the James Bond trademarks. The cool car, the women with absurd names, the gadgets, the henchmen, and it's just all done and executed in a way that's not too campy. There's a bit of camp in there with a guy who throws his hat, for God's sake, but it was still done in a way that was kind of serious and in a way that you kind of bought it. The Aston Martin DB5 is, I mean, is it up for debate at this point that it's the coolest and most iconic Bond car of all time? By the way, check out my Lego version of the Aston Martin DB5. Pretty cool, right? I've also still got Goldfinger's Rolls Royce, which, no word of a lie, this has been in our family possession for the past 25 years. Again, our job was the first big ridiculous Bond henchman, ridiculous in that they had a crazy gimmick. Again, he throws his friggin' hat, but it was badass. He was a badass character, and I love the fight with him and Bond in Fort Knox. And yeah, this is a Bond film that I just find impossible to dislike because everything you know and love about James Bond is here in this film, established in this film, and it's just pulled off really well and just really memorably, and it just has to make the top 5 Bond films. Coming in at number 3, we go from Goldfinger to GoldenEye. Pierce Brosnan's first James Bond film, the first James Bond film of the 1990s, and this film screams 1995 in all the best possible ways. I think of GoldenEye, and whenever I watch it, and I'm just reminded of all the video games that came out on the PS2 in the early 2000s, like Agent Under Fire and Nightfire. And there's just something about that vibe of James Bond that I really do love. This film brought James Bond into the modern era and gave him a modern style action film, and the action in GoldenEye is some of the best of the entire franchise. Completely in camera, totally practical, real cars, real stunts, and it's just straight up one of the best action films I've ever seen. It would probably have to be my top 10 action films of all time, just in general. And Pierce Brosnan did a good job as Bond in this. He has that sense of humour, he has that ladies' man charm to him, but he also kicks ass when needed. And he actually kicks a lot of ass in here. This is probably the most ass kickery that James Bond ever did in one film at that point. And I quite like Sean Bean as Alec Trevelyan in 006. He's honestly one of my favourite Bond villains, not in terms of the writing of his character, just the performance, the fact that it's Sean Bean, and just the character itself I just find fun and entertaining to watch. Sometimes that's all you need for a character and a villain in a film, and Sean Bean gave me that in GoldenEye. And Famke Janssen as Xenia Onatopp might be the best female Bond villain of all time, perhaps. Definitely up there. I don't love the rest of Brosnan's Bond films, but GoldenEye kicked off that very specific era of Bond with, again, all the video games that came after it with Pierce Brosnan's likeness. So from about 1995 to about 2004, I do have a bit of a soft spot for that era of Bond, and GoldenEye kicked it off in incredible fashion. I'm pretty sure I've said this in every single top 10 list I've ever made, but number 1 and 2 are neck and neck. They can swap out and interchange at the click of a finger any day. But for now, number 2 is Skyfall. Earlier on, I was talking about nostalgia with Live and Let Die, childhood nostalgia. It makes me feel very bittersweet and sad that I have nostalgia for Skyfall, because I was there opening night 2012 when this film came out, and I was mesmerized when I saw this film on the big screen, because this film, kind of like Her Majesty's Secret Service, is one of the most cinematic feeling Bond films with Roger Deakins' cinematography, which, I'm just going to say it, this is the best looking James Bond film that's ever been put to screen. But I absolutely love and adore the tone and the mood and the atmosphere of Skyfall. It's probably the most serious and maybe the darkest James Bond film, but I love it for that. Sam Mendes says he was inspired by The Dark Knight when making Skyfall, and Skyfall, it's probably been said a lot, is kind of like the Dark Knight of the Bond films. James Bond once again feels like a vulnerable human being, and I like how the film is James Bond kind of coming back into his own, because he's shot at the beginning, he's out of commission for a while, he comes back and he's really struggling to get into field shape. But through the story and getting back out there into the field and doing this mission, he rediscovers the inner James Bond. And by the end of the film, Bond is back, he's a badass. And let's just talk about Javier Bardem as Silver, because in my opinion, he is the best villain of the entire Bond franchise. Not just because of Javier Bardem's performance and the fact that it's a Bond villain who actually gets his hands dirty. He doesn't just sit back and let all of his cronies do all the dirty work, but it's also his story, his conviction, and his motivations for revenge. You feel it, and it just makes the whole film and the whole story feel personal, which is something that some Bond films tried to do in the past, sometimes kind of succeeded, but this film was the first one that truly succeeded with flying colours. I truly felt his hatred for M, and he just brings that through in his performance. And to me, again, I do think he's the best Bond villain of all time. I'll stand by that. I've already talked about Roger Deakins' cinematography, Sam Mendes' direction, Adele's theme song is my all-time favourite James Bond theme song as well. The third act at Skyfall Lodge, some people have talked crap about it. I absolutely adore it. I love how it's a complete flip on the James Bond formula, where it's a Bond villain kind of invading James Bond's lair of sorts. I like that interpretation of it anyway. And the cinematography of the Scottish Highlands, it's turning nighttime, the mood, the atmosphere, the actual action itself within the third act is exciting and entertaining. And just in general, it was just so different for a Bond climax. And that's why I adored it, amongst all those other reasons I just said. I adore Skyfall unabashedly. I know it's got some hate over the years, but I do not care. It's one of my, well, it's my number 2 favourite James Bond film of all time, and it's just one of my favourite films of all time in general. Which leaves us with number 1, and at this point it's a foregone conclusion what number 1 is. It's of course Casino Royale. The Bond film that came before Casino Royale was Die Another Day, which to me is the Batman and Robin of the Bond franchise. Kind of embarrassing. So Casino Royale stripped away all the bullshit, all the stupid campy bollocks, all the over-the-top gadgets and shit like that, and took us back to basics. It rebooted Bond, we see him get his 00 status, and we see James Bond in a position that we have never ever seen him before in the franchise at that point, which is inexperienced. He is on the mission for the very first time, and he's not James Bond yet. He doesn't have the catchphrases, he's not the smooth ladies man entirely. Well, he is, but when he seduces Solange, he gets the information and leaves immediately. He doesn't sleep with her. He's purely a man on a mission. He's the assassin, he's the spy, and that's, I just love that so much about Casino Royale, amidst everything else. Martin Campbell's direction, the musical score, the theme song by Chris Cornell, rest in peace, you know my name. The action sequences, the parkour chase on the cranes with Malacca is insanely great. The poker match, by far the best poker match ever put in a film ever. You feel the tension in that thing through the entirety of it. And Vesper Lynd, possibly the best Bond girl of all time. I feel bad calling her a Bond girl because a Bond girl has the, the connotations of just being good looking and, again, something for James Bond to sleep with. But she's a character, she's a human being with emotions. And the way they fall in love, it's so believable. The chemistry is great. And of course, the tragedy at the end, all of it just absolutely hits and resonates. And yeah, it's just an incredible film all around. I love everything about Casino Royale. Le Chiffre, again, one of the best Bond villains. You feel his desperation. Such an interesting, compelling villain. Mads Mikkelsen, one of his best performances, one of his best roles, I think. I'll put it like this. In terms of what came before and the need for franchise revitalization and how successful Casino Royale was at doing it, Casino Royale, in my opinion, is the greatest reboot of all time. And thus, for me, the best James Bond film of all time. So there you go. Those are my top 10 James Bond films. What are your top 10 James Bond films? And what do you think about Amazon controlling the Bond franchise now? Are you excited? Are you nervous? Are you skeptical? Tell me all your opinions, thoughts, anything you want about James Bond down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.